At 2 in the morning, Mark Thompson stood in his mother-in-law's driveway in Long Island, quietly winching a broken-down tractor off his trailer. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from trying not to laugh. Next to the tractor, he carefully placed a massive wooden crate, 4 feet by 4 feet, packed with chainsaws, tools, and a shop vacuum. Then he drove away, leaving everything right next to her car. When she woke up that morning and saw what he'd done, she called the police. But behind closed doors, this wasn't vandalism. This was the most calculated act of malicious compliance a son-in-law had ever pulled off. And it all started with a family property deal that went terribly, perfectly wrong. Welcome to Behind Closed Doors, where family drama, petty revenge, and perfect karma collide. Today's story is about a man who got so fed up with his toxic mother-in-law that he decided to give her exactly what she asked for, in the most inconvenient way possible. If you love stories of justified revenge and family justice, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's get into it. Mark Thompson had been married to his wife Jennifer for 12 years. They had 3 beautiful children, a comfortable home in Connecticut, and by all accounts, a happy life. But there was one dark cloud that hung over their family gatherings. One person who could suck the joy out of any room just by walking into it. Jennifer's mother, Linda. Linda lived in Long Island, New York, and according to Mark, she was the most narcissistic, self-serving person he'd ever encountered. She was the kind of person who made every conversation about herself, who turned every family event into a drama, and who seemed to feed off creating chaos and misery wherever she went. The thing that bothered Mark the most wasn't just Linda's personality. It was her selective involvement in her grandchildren's lives. In the past 5 years, Linda had visited exactly one of her 3 grandchildren's birthdays. And the reason she'd made that particular trip? Because she'd bought a lamp at an auction in Greenwich, Connecticut, which happened to be only 30 minutes from Mark and Jennifer's house. She was perfectly willing to drive off Long Island for a piece of furniture, but apparently couldn't be bothered to make the same trip for her own grandchildren. Mark found this infuriating, but he'd learned to keep his distance. Thankfully, Linda was too nervous to drive far from Long Island, so they only had to see her once or twice a year. Behind closed doors, Mark and Jennifer had an understanding. They'd maintain basic civility with Linda, but they wouldn't go out of their way to include her in their lives. 5 years ago, Mark and Jennifer had purchased a property that would change everything. Jennifer's uncle owned a cabin on 17 acres of beautiful land in upstate New York. The cabin itself was a bit run down, but Mark saw potential. The property came with a few sheds, various tools and equipment, and 2 old Ford farm tractors. It was the kind of place where a family could escape, where kids could run free, and where Mark could work with his hands fixing things up. Jennifer's uncle was elderly and had no use for any of the items on the property anymore. He lived in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. What was he going to do with a tractor in the city? So when Mark and Jennifer made their offer, they specified in the purchase agreement that all contents convey. Everything on the property would be theirs. The uncle agreed. The deal was done. Mark and Jennifer spent that first summer fixing up the cabin, clearing brush, and making the property their own little paradise. They went up there as often as they could during the warm months, and the kids loved it. But then, about a month after closing on the property, Mark received a phone call that would set the stage for years of tension. It was Linda, and she had some interesting news. Apparently, some of the items on the property weren't actually the uncle's to sell. They had belonged to Jennifer's other uncle, Linda's brother, who had passed away several years earlier. According to Linda, she had inherited these items. The chainsaws, one of the tractors, the older, less functional one, a shop vacuum, and various miscellaneous tools that were stored in one of the sheds. These were all hers, she claimed, and she wanted them back. Jennifer was taken aback. Nobody had mentioned any of this before closing. If Linda had items she wanted from the property, she'd had plenty of time to retrieve them. The property had been on the market for months. But Linda insisted. These were her things, left to her by her deceased brother, and she had every right to them. Mark wasn't particularly bothered by the claim itself. They had their own tools and equipment. He didn't really need a second tractor, especially one that barely ran. If Linda wanted her stuff, fine. They could work something out. Mark told Linda that she should have collected everything before they closed on the property. But since she hadn't, they'd figure out a solution. The problem began when Mark and Jennifer decided they wanted to tear down one of the old sheds. It was falling apart, and Mark had plans to build a proper garage in that spot. But Linda's tractor was stored in that shed. So Mark called Linda and proposed a simple solution. They would sell the tractor, which didn't run and was essentially junk anyway, and give Linda the money. They'd also box up all the other items she claimed, the tools, chainsaws, and shop vacuum, and bring them to her the next time they drove down to the city. Linda's response was immediate and furious. Absolutely not. She was not ready to part with the tractor. It had sentimental value, she said. It had belonged to her brother. She wasn't selling it, and Mark had no right to sell it either. If he touched any of her property, she would sue him. Mark tried reasoning with her. The tractor didn't run. It was taking up space in a shed they needed to tear down. It would cost more to repair than it was worth. But Linda wouldn't budge. Behind closed doors, her stubbornness had nothing to do with sentimentality or practicality. It was about control. It was about making sure Mark and Jennifer didn't get everything they wanted. It was about being difficult for the sake of being difficult. Jennifer was genuinely upset by her mother's threats. She knew how her mother operated, how she could turn a simple disagreement into years of drama and legal threats. But Mark told his wife not to worry. He would take care of it. And, behind closed doors, a plan was already forming in his mind. A plan that would solve the problem permanently, give Linda exactly what she claimed to want, and deliver the most satisfying dose of karma Mark could imagine. The following weekend, Mark and Jennifer drove up to the cabin with the kids. It was a beautiful summer day, perfect for working outside. While Jennifer and the kids played by the creek, Mark got to work. He rolled the old tractor out of the shed. It took some effort. The thing barely moved, even on flat ground, but he managed. Then he gathered up all of Linda's claimed possessions, the chainsaws, the shop vacuum, the random assortment of tools from the shed. He loaded everything into a large wooden crate he'd built, about 4 feet by 4 feet and 3 feet tall. It was heavy, easily 300 pounds when fully loaded. Jennifer came over and asked what he was doing. Mark told her he was just putting her mother's stuff together. Jennifer asked why, and Mark explained that Linda needed to either take the stuff, sell it, or let them sell it, because they were starting on the garage tomorrow and the shed had to come down. Jennifer rolled her eyes and said the stuff could just sit outside for all she cared. She was done dealing with her mother's drama. That night, after Jennifer and the kids had gone to bed, Mark put his plan into motion. He had already hooked up his trailer earlier in the day. Now, working as quietly as possible, he used a winch to load the non-functional tractor onto the trailer. The winch made some noise, but not enough to wake anyone in the cabin. He secured the tractor, then loaded the massive wooden crate full of tools. Everything was ready. Mark checked his watch. It was just after midnight. He climbed into his truck and began the 2.5-hour drive to Long Island. The whole way there, Mark couldn't stop grinning. He knew this was petty. He knew it was probably going to cause problems. But after years of Linda's narcissism, her threats, her refusal to be reasonable, this felt like justice. He was giving her exactly what she said she wanted. Her stuff. At her house. Where she could deal with it. Mark arrived at Linda's house around 2:30 in the morning. Her neighborhood was quiet, the kind of upper-middle-class Long Island suburb where nothing interesting ever happened, especially not at 2 in the morning. Mark backed his trailer into Linda's driveway. This required some skill. He'd done a lot of trailer backing in his time, and he was proud of how quietly and efficiently he managed it. He positioned the trailer ramps right next to Linda's car. Then came the tricky part. Getting the tractor off the trailer without making too much noise. Mark used jacks to tilt the trailer bed, allowing the tractor to slowly roll off using the winch. Jacks are loud, so he placed a sweater under them to muffle the sound. Inch by inch, the tractor rolled down the ramps. It made some noise, metal scraping, wheels creaking, but not enough to wake the neighborhood. Or so Mark hoped. His heart was pounding. He kept expecting lights to turn on, for Linda to come storming out, or for a police cruiser to roll up and ask what the hell he was doing. But nothing happened. The tractor was finally off the trailer, sitting in Linda's driveway right next to her car. Next, Mark unloaded the massive wooden crate. He'd brought a dolly, but even with that, the crate was almost impossible to move. He managed to roll it down next to the tractor. Now came the final step. He needed to get his dolly back, because if he left it, Linda might actually be able to move the crate. So he used the jacks again to lift the crate just enough to slide the dolly out. The whole operation took about 20 minutes. Mark was drenched in sweat, partially from the physical effort, but mostly from the adrenaline. He couldn't believe he hadn't been caught. No neighbors had looked out their windows. No police had driven by. It was almost too easy. Mark loaded his equipment back into the truck, took one last look at his handiwork, the tractor and the giant crate sitting right in Linda's driveway, blocking her car, and drove away. He was laughing so hard he could barely see the road. This was the most ridiculous, petty, perfect thing he'd ever done. He knew Jennifer was going to be furious, or maybe she'd find it hilarious. He wasn't entirely sure. But either way, he didn't regret it for a second. The drive home felt shorter than the drive there, probably because Mark was riding high on adrenaline and the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. He arrived back at the cabin around 5 in the morning. The sun was just starting to rise. Mark tried to slip back into bed quietly, but Jennifer woke up. She asked where he'd been. Mark, thinking quickly, told her he'd gone out to get breakfast for everyone. So he turned around, drove to the nearest town, and bought bagels, coffee, and donuts. When he got back to the cabin, Jennifer noticed the trailer was still hooked up to the truck. She asked why. Mark said he wasn't sure if he'd need to make a run to the lumber yard later, so he hadn't bothered unhooking it. This was a lie, of course, but a plausible one. Mark was buzzing with nervous energy. He kept checking his phone, waiting for the inevitable call. 8 o'clock came and went. Nothing. 8:30. Still nothing. Thankfully, it was a bit chilly that morning, so no one had gone outside yet. No one had noticed the tractor was missing. At 9:15, Jennifer's phone rang. Mark saw her look at the caller ID and roll her eyes. It was Linda. Jennifer hated talking to her mother, but Mark gestured for her to answer. As soon as Jennifer picked up, everyone in the room could hear Linda screaming. Jennifer pulled the phone away from her ear, looking confused and alarmed. She had no idea what her mother was talking about. Mark walked over, held out his hand for the phone, and Jennifer gave it to him. He put it on speaker. Linda was mid-rant. Something about property and trespassing and how dare they. Mark interrupted her calmly. You wanted your tractor. You got it. Then he hung up. 3. Jennifer stared at Mark in disbelief. She asked what he'd done. Mark explained everything. The midnight drive. Loading the tractor and crate. Leaving it all in Linda's driveway at 2 in the morning. For a moment Jennifer just stood there processing. Then she started laughing. She laughed so hard she had tears in her eyes. She called Mark insane, ridiculous, and possibly the pettiest person she'd ever met. But she also admitted it was brilliant. Linda had been threatening to sue if they sold her stuff. Well, now she had her stuff. All of it. At her house. Exactly as she'd demanded. Behind closed doors, Jennifer had been dreading years of legal threats and family drama over this tractor. Now, suddenly, that problem was solved in the most absurd way possible. But the drama wasn't over. Linda called back. 10 more times over the next hour, all going unanswered. Then the text started. I'm calling the police. You can't do this. This is illegal. Jennifer started to panic a bit. What if Linda really did call the cops? What if Mark actually got in trouble? Mark told her not to worry. He'd handle it. He knew he hadn't technically done anything illegal. He'd returned Linda's property to her. Sure, He'd done it at 2 in the morning without asking. But it was her stuff, on her property. What was the crime? Around 1 in the afternoon, Mark's phone rang. The caller ID showed a Long Island area code and a name he didn't recognize. He answered. "This is Officer Martinez with the Nassau County Police. I'm here with Linda Chen. She says you dumped property on her driveway without permission." Mark took a deep breath and calmly explained the situation. He told the officer about the property purchase, about Linda's claim that the tractor and tools belonged to her, about her refusal to let them sell or move anything, and about her threats to sue. He explained that all he'd done was return her property to her. It was her tractor, her tools, her stuff. He'd simply delivered it to her house. On the other end of the line, Mark could hear Linda in the background, still yelling. The officer asked her to calm down. He asked Linda if it was, in fact, her tractor. She said yes, but she didn't want it there. She wanted them to take it back. The officer asked if there was any storage agreement or contract that specified where the tractor should be kept. Linda said no. The officer asked Mark if he'd damaged any property or broken any locks. Mark said no. He'd simply backed into the driveway and unloaded items that belonged to her. The officer sighed. He told Linda that there wasn't really anything he could do. This appeared to be a civil family dispute, not a criminal matter. If she wanted to press charges for trespassing, she'd need proof that Mark had been on her property. But since he'd left the items in the driveway, visible from the street, that would be hard to prove. Besides, the items were legally hers. Mark could hear the officer trying very hard to remain professional, but it was clear he'd realized Linda was difficult to deal with. He told Linda she should contact a lawyer if she wanted to pursue this further. But from a police standpoint, no crime had been committed. Linda was furious, but there was nothing she could do. The officer ended the call. Mark hung up and looked at Jennifer. They both burst out laughing again. It had worked. Not only had Mark solved the tractor problem, but he'd done it in a way that was technically legal and absolutely infuriating to Linda. For the next 6 months, Linda didn't speak to Mark or Jennifer. She didn't call. She didn't text. She didn't show up for any family events. And honestly, for Mark and Jennifer, it was the most peaceful 6 months they'd had in years. Behind closed doors, they joked that Mark should have delivered that tractor years ago. Eventually, Linda did reach out again. She never apologized, of course, but the tractor was never mentioned. Mark later heard through family gossip that Linda had to pay someone to haul the tractor and crate away, since she had no way to move them herself. It apparently cost her several $100s. Mark considered that a bonus. The cabin in upstate New York is still Mark and Jennifer's favorite escape. The shed where Linda's tractor used to sit is now a beautiful garage. The kids are older now, but they still love going up there in the summer. And every time Mark drives past that garage, he smiles, remembering the night he delivered a 2-ton tractor to Long Island at 2 in the morning. It was petty. It was absurd. It was perfect. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't about being cruel. It's about giving someone exactly what they asked for, in the most inconvenient way possible. And sometimes, the people who make your life difficult end up creating their own karma. All you have to do is help it along a little bit. So here's the question for you. If you had a toxic family member who refused to be reasonable, would you go to these lengths to prove a point? Or would you just cut them off completely? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing your stories and perspectives. And if you enjoyed this story of petty revenge and family karma, make sure to check out our video about the husband who discovered his wife's affair and spent 6 months planning the perfect exit. That story is linked in the description. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching Behind Closed Doors, where family secrets, betrayals, and perfect revenge are always just one story away. We'll see you in the next one.